protect the health and safety of all participants, including our interpreters. You'll notice there's a QR code on the card. It links to a short awareness video. Pursuant to the routine motion adopted by the committee, I can confirm that the witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of this meeting. Please wait until I recognize you by name before you speak. All comments should be addressed through the chair. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Monday, September 22nd, 2025, the committee is meeting to study the state of the journalism and media sectors. And with us today, we have from Bell Media, Richard Gray and Jean-Philippe Pinault. With Cogeco Media, we have Carolyn Jamette. With Gonez Media, do we have Brandon Gonez, or he is not in the room yet, but we have a name card for him. Avec nous en ligne, on a
Online, we have Group Radio Simard, Martin Simard, and Michelle Lorraine, who is in a very nice environment indeed. I'm a bit jealous, to be honest.
Finally, with the Tri-Cities Community TV here in the room, we have Kathy Sena, Executive Director. Each of you will have 5 minutes to present us with some opening comments, and it's 5 minutes per organization. So we'll start with Bell Media, Richard Gray and Jean-Philippe Pinault. You have 5 minutes. I'm sorry.
Point of order. I need a clarification, please, on the training that we got this morning regarding invites sent out to Minister Miller. We sent out 2 invites that were sent. One on the current study. The minister was confirmed to come and appear May 5th next week, but he's only coming for an hour. And that'll be to appear to speak to the study on the supplementary estimates, meaning we can ask whatever questions we want, but that means that we won't have had him appear according to the motion to talk about the media, and I don't think that's acceptable. Thank you. Any comments?
Yes, sorry, I guess I would just seek further clarification. This is the first that I've heard of that. My understanding was that the minister is coming as per the motion for the study on media fairness. That is the motion that was approved by this committee, that the minister would come for one of these meetings. And then the second motion that was also passed by this committee, and as is a custom of this House and an obligation of the minister, is that he needs to appear with regards to the main estimates. So given that there are 2 motions that compel his appearance here for 2 separate meetings, I'd like to have some understanding as to why the minister would only appear for one.
Perhaps the clerk have you gotten anything from his office, perhaps? All we were told was that he was available for one meeting. He's traveling for part of May. Mrs. Thomas.
Then I would move a motion that we report to the House that the minister failed to appear according to the motions passed here.
Mr. Miles?
I think we can give him a chance to respond. I don't think he's been deliberately uncommunicative to the committee. There were 2 invites. He's responded to one, but I think we can give them a chance to respond to what's been said, here in the committee. And the second invite, it could be as easy as a miscommunication as to which one he's coming for, and so let's give him a chance to respond accordingly.
Mr. Champoux.
Mr. Champoux, I think we can remind the minister that we will see him in the context of this study. It was in the motion. Regarding the estimates, that's also his responsibility. I would be open to the minister coming for 2 hours, 1 hour for each subject. That could be a compromise. Maybe that would work better for his agenda. I know he's traveling a lot, and we do have a deadline. So why don't we say that he come for 2 hours?
Mrs. Thomas, I think you were next.
Thank you, Chair. I can appreciate Mr. Champoux' offer. I think we could check back with the minister. If it's a matter of availability, he's already has one day in his schedule booked off for this, and so perhaps he could give us 2 hours in order to meet the requirements of the motions that have been passed here by the members of this committee.
So perhaps the clerk can communicate with the minister what this committee has discussed this morning? Sure. Mrs. Thomas?
Further to that, I would ask that we request of the minister that we are given an answer as to whether or not he will appear for those 2 hours within 1 week's time.
Okay, we will put that request out through the letter. Thank you very much. Anything further on this? All right, back to our witnesses. I see we have Mr. Brandon Gomez in the room. Good to see you again, sir. But we will start with a 5-minute opening statement from Bell Media. Richard Gray and Jean-Philippe Pinault. Collectively, you have 5 minutes, starting now.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And members of the committee, my name is Richard Gray, Vice President of CTV News. I'm pleased to be here today alongside my colleague Jean-Philippe Pinault, General Manager of News and Operations at Bell Media in Quebec. We are here on behalf of Bell Media's news organizations, including CTV News and Nouveau Info, which together form the largest private sector news gathering operation in Canada. Throughout my 35-year career in television news, I've been deeply connected to the realities of producing daily journalism for Canadian communities. I began my career as a local reporter and weekend news anchor in Timmins before moving into newsroom leadership roles in communities including Pembroke, Ottawa, and Victoria. Today, I oversee CTV's national news operations, working closely with local news directors across the country. CTV News produces local newscasts across Canada that deliver trusted, community-based journalism at a time when many local news outlets have closed or significantly reduced their operations. Each week, more than 6 million Canadians watch CTV local newscasts, and last year we produced over 20,000 hours of local news. That level of production goes well beyond minimum regulatory requirements and reflects our strong commitment to serving communities. CTV National News provides Canadians with trusted reporting on national and international events. Together, this local and national structure ensures that stories from every region of Canada are reflected both in local newscasts and in national reporting. Just as importantly, CTV News is Canada's #1 digital news provider, reaching 15 million Canadians each month, while upholding the accuracy, credibility, and public trust essential to professional journalism. And as of last year, live local and national news is available to Canadians on Bell Media's Crave streaming service. These significant investments in broadcast and digital journalism are being made in the face of significant structural challenges. Advertising revenues have migrated rapidly to global digital platforms. Viewing habits continue to shift. At the same time, Canadian broadcasters face far greater regulatory and financial obligations than foreign digital and streaming companies competing in the same market. As a result, the economics of local journalism remain under serious strain. At Bell Media alone, news operations lose approximately $40 million a year, despite continued investment and strong audience performance. These pressures are real, and they directly affect the long-term sustainability of local news. From our perspective, there is a constructive path forward. Extending the Canadian journalism labour tax credit to broadcast news would recognize the role that television and digital newsrooms continue to play in communities across Canada. And ensuring a level regulatory playing field between Canadian broadcasters and global digital platforms is essential if local journalism is to remain viable. I'll now turn to Jean-Philippe to speak about Nouveau Info in Quebec.
Merci Richard. J'ai passé plus de 23 ans de carrière dans les médias francophones, d'abord comme journaliste.
I've built my 23-year career in French-language media, first as a journalist and as a manager. My experience includes working for both local and national print dailies, leading Canada's largest news agency, talk radio, now in television and digital media. 5 years ago, Bell Media launched a new French-language newsroom from the ground up with Nouveau Info, at a time when many news organizations were scaling back. That investment expanded the range of French-language news available in Quebec to Quebec audiences. Along with newscasts, Nouveau Info has made significant investments in digital platforms. These investments have grown Nouveau Info's audience, particularly among younger viewers. helping ensure that French-language journalism remains relevant to the next generation of Quebecers. Nouveau Info also invests in widely praised investigative reporting, making a real difference for communities. Like our English-language colleagues, Nouveau Info journalists are deeply rooted in their communities and committed to serving the public interest. Nouveau Info faces the same economic pressures affecting newsrooms across the country. In closing, trusted and credible journalism is essential to Canadian democracy, especially in an era of growing misinformation. CTV News and Nouveau Info remain committed to delivering fact-based reporting that helps Canadians stay informed and engaged in civic life. Thank you.
Merci à vous.
Thank you.
Carolyn Jamet, excuse me. You have 5 minutes starting now. Go ahead.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you. Members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to be here today. My name is Caroline Jamet, and I'm the CEO of Cogeco. We run 21 radio stations across Quebec and Eastern Ontario, reaching nearly 4.5 million listeners each week. French-language commercial radio plays an essential role in our society and our democracy. Its role goes far beyond simply broadcasting news and entertainment content. It extends to connecting the public with political, economic, social, and cultural actors. Radio brings our communities to life by enriching their public spaces. For over 40 years, Cogeco media stations have contributed to the free flow of ideas and information and helped shape the identity of the communities where they operate. We are proud to invest in the production and dissemination of news that matter to people here. We are often the only bulwark against the emergence of media deserts. Unfortunately, this role in local content is eroding as the Canadian media system undergoes major upheavals. Foreign giants, which are becoming increasingly dominant, have transformed Canadians' consumption habits and diverted the advertising market beyond our borders. To preserve local voices, the government must act now. Furthermore, our industry's regulatory framework was established decades ago. It is excessive and largely out of step with today's reality. Not only are digital giants exempt from regulatory constraints, but they also enjoy tax advantages. Today, approximately 70% of advertising investment in Canada is captured by foreign platforms. Conversely, Canadian media that produce local content have barely 30% of that market and a meager 4% in radio. If nothing is done, the information gap will widen and more media deserts will emerge, particularly outside major urban centers. It is therefore urgent to take action so that our private radio stations can continue to serve our communities. Let us remember that since 2008, more than 600 Canadian media outlets have closed their doors. In an era of misinformation, the journalistic content and local news provided by our radio stations are needed now more than ever. In a recent poll of Quebecers, 90% said that the media, including private radio, are important for democracy. 85% said they believe that private radio broadcasts share credible information. In 2019, the government introduced a tax credit to support the Canadian print media. However, radio stations, which also produce essential high-quality journalism, are not eligible. As a democratic society, we need Canadian private media to continue fulfilling their role for people here. It will not be Meta or Fox News that goes to Saint-Jérôme to inform citizens about the impact of a new factory, nor will it be them informing Saguenay residents about the closure of a local ER. Local radio stations self-fund all their content without external support. They invest in local news and are subject to strict regulation. Foreign platforms, on the other hand, get Canadian advertising revenue without any equivalent obligation regarding content or cultural contribution. We thus call on the government and the CRTC to take action and recognize the severity of the structural disruptions affecting radio. To this end, the federal government must continue its policy of national preference and take action on 5 fronts. 1. The Income Tax Act contains a loophole in Section 19. This allows Canadian advertisers to deduct their advertising expenses when they purchase ads on platforms like Facebook. This is inconsistent with the challenges facing Canadian media. The application of Section 19 must be extended to foreign online companies to eliminate this competitive advantage for digital giants. 2. We call for the creation of a 20% tax credit for local advertising purchases. 3, the federal government must lead by example and prioritize advertising purchases from Canadian media. Moreover, the public overwhelmingly supports a policy that prioritizes local media, with 87% of French-speaking Quebecers backing it, according to SOM. 4, we are calling for radio to be included in the tax credit for Canadian journalism in line with the model presented by the Government of Quebec in its most recent budget. This injustice towards radio must end now. 5, finally, the CRTC must ease any regulatory burden weighing on our industry while platforms face no such obligations. These measures are not intended to protect an outdated business model, but rather to preserve Canadians' ability to be informed by local voices. Thank you for your time. Thank you.
To Gonez Media, Brandon Gonez, you now have the floor for 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation to appear today as part of this important study. My name is Brandon Gonez. I am the founder and CEO of Gonez Media, a Canadian-owned independent digital media company based in Toronto and one of the fastest growing in the country. Before founding Gonez Media, I spent 7 years in Canadian broadcast journalism. I started in 2014 in northern British Columbia, the second smallest television market in this country. From there, I worked through Global News in Regina, CTV News in Barrie, and CTV's national morning show Your Morning, and eventually CP24 in Toronto. That journey gave me a front row seat to this country's media landscape, from the smallest local markets to national broadcast. And what I saw at every level was an industry filled with talented people and important institutions, but one struggling to keep pace with where Canadians were actually going. So in 2021, I left and I built something from scratch. Today, Gonez Media produces original written, video, and audio content like The Bee Gees Show, which is Canada's #1 digital current affairs and entertainment show, and publishes Now Toronto, one of this country's most followed and recognized independent media brands. Our team is just over 20 people strong. We are one of Canada's fastest growing independent digital media companies, and our content reaches over 50 million monthly views across our brands. We are proof that independent Canadian media can compete, can grow, and can build something sustainable. That growth reflects a larger reality. Canadians still want trusted journalism and quality content, but they are consuming it differently. They are mobile first and expect speed, relevance, and direct engagement. The audience has moved, but policy has not fully followed. Since 2008, more than 526 local news outlets have closed across Canada, while our population grew by roughly a quarter. Today, 2.5 million Canadians live in a postal code with only one or no local news source. Meanwhile, digital media now outpaces traditional formats in Canada at nearly a 2-to-1 ratio. The platforms where Canadians spend their time have changed dramatically. The policy frameworks governing Canadian media have not kept pace with that reality. Bill C-18 was introduced with good intentions to address a real imbalance, but its outcomes revealed the need for a broader strategy. When trusted Canadian journalism becomes less visible in digital spaces, less reliable sources fill the gap. That is a public interest problem, and it tells us that the right approach is not only about regulating platforms, but also actively investing in the Canadian media ecosystem itself. Which brings me to what I would like this committee to consider. The existing programs are doing important work for outlets that have crossed certain thresholds, but there is a gap. There are independent digital media companies across this country past the startup phase, producing journalism, serving communities, and building meaningful audiences, yet hitting a ceiling because there is no policy infrastructure designed to help them scale. Canada has a talent. We have the stories. That talent includes founders from all different communities, including Black, Indigenous, immigrant, and other underrepresented communities who deserve a fair opportunity to build lasting media businesses. We have audiences hungry for content that reflects who we actually are. What we need is a policy environment that rewards innovation and helps the next generation of Canadian media companies grow into something lasting. 3 recommendations for this committee's consideration. 1, create a digital media innovation incentive. Targeted growth support for Canadian-owned digital media companies that are producing original content, creating jobs, and demonstrating sustainable operations. Not a handout, we're talking an investment in what is already working. Number 2, introduce advertiser incentives that encourage Canadian businesses to direct a meaningful portion of their advertising spend towards certified Canadian digital media. We want to keep private market dollars in the Canadian journalism ecosystem rather than defaulting entirely to foreign platforms. And number 3, ensure the next generation of Canadian media policy is built with digital native, independently owned operators as core stakeholders, not afterthoughts. This is not about saving the old model, it's about building the new one. What we've built at Gonas Media is proof that it is possible, but we should not be the exception, we should be the blueprint. I am here today because I believe this committee has a real opportunity to shape what Canadian media looks like for the next 20 years and beyond. I hope you will seize it. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Ensuite, je donne la parole
Next, Simar Group, Martin Simar and Michelle Lorraine. You have 5 minutes. Madam Chair, I would like to thank you for inviting me to participate in this consultation. My name is Martin Simar, Executive Vice President of Radio Simar Group. I am here today with Michelle Laurent, our broadcasting consultant. It is a privilege to be able to share with you the challenges facing French-language commercial radio stations and to contribute to your work. Group Radio Simar is a family-owned company that operates 8 radio stations in Quebec, in Rimouski, Baie-Comeau, Rivière-du-Loup, Lac-Pocatière, Montmarny, Saint-Georges-de-Beauce, as well as news sites dedicated to local and regional news. Our company was founded in 1947 by my grandfather, Luc Simar. Next year, we will celebrate 80 years of operations, dedicated to informing, entertaining, and reflecting our communities and promoting our local culture. Our work has a direct impact on the vitality of Quebec's predominant. Regional journalism is not simply a local variation of local national news. It is a beating heart of our communities. It tells the stories of what is happening here. It creates a sense of community that no other media can truly replace. For several years now, the media has been undergoing a profound transformation. Audience fragmentation, the rise of global digital platforms, and the shift in advertising revenue have disrupted the economic balance that historically And yet, the need for reliable, rigorous, and independent local news has never.
Rumeurs, désinformation et contenu non vérifié.
The interpreter is flagging that the witness's connectivity is breaking up and service will be affected in consequence. Mr. Simar, excuse me, we're losing you from time to time. You're freezing up. Oh, should I? Well, I'm hearing that the connection is good, but just a heads up, we are losing you. Your screen is freezing. Perfectly. The feature, the interpreter flags, that connection has frozen. To adapt their format and invest to reach listeners where they are. The interpreter flags that the connection has frozen. Radio remains a powerful medium in the countryside. No algorithm can replace the interpreter flags that the speaker has frozen to remain deeply rooted. The interpreter flags that the speaker has frozen. Currently, Radio Canada has such financial resources that has become practically impossible for us to be competitive in terms of salaries, which hinders the recruitment of journalistic talent. In our region, independent television, for its part, benefits from generous contributions from the Fund for Independent Television News. Meanwhile, the News Fund for Radio News cannot be financed due to the elimination of the tax on digital products. In some areas, even subsidized community radio stations have greater financial resources than private radio, which creates unfair competition. Public policy has a role to play in ensuring a level playing field between local players, subsidized entities, and large unregulated international platforms. The funding of journalism, access to digital revenue streams, including those from the Canadian government, and recognition of the role of regional media must remain top priorities. It is unfair that the Canadian government provides tax credits to support the journalistic workforce of print media, while electronic media, such as radio, are left out. The government of Quebec has recognized this inequity and corrected this situation in its latest budget. At Group Radio Simar, we firmly believe that the regions are not on the periphery of information, they are its foundation. The interpreter will simply read Mr. Simard's speech. We cannot allow national content to be the only thing reaching regional audiences. Become the sole local and regional source of information for our communities. Investing in regional journalism means investing in the democratic, economic, and cultural vitality of our country. In closing, let me remind you of this. The future of the media will not be determined solely by technology or business models. It will be determined by our collective commitment to preserving quality journalism and a diversity of voices accessible to everyone, everywhere in the country. The challenge is great, but so is the opportunity. Thank you for your time. And we are ready for your questions. Thank you.
From Port Moody, we have Kathy Sena with Tri-Cities Community TV. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Madam Chair. Good morning, and thank you, committee, for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Kathy Chenna, and I'm the Executive Director of Tri-Cities Community Television in British Columbia. I've been involved in community television and local journalism for over 11 years as both a host and community-based journalist. I'd like to begin by offering an important distinction. While many organizations participating in the local journalism initiative are traditional broadcasters serving what are often called media deserts, we represent a different but equally important gap. We are an access-based community television organization operating in what I would describe as a community television desert. In many regions across British Columbia, such as Kelowna, Kamloops, and Penticton, residents have access to community television through providers like Rogers. But here in the Lower Mainland, despite being one of the most populated areas in the province, there are no equivalent opportunities for community-driven television. And that gap matters. Because community media is not just about broadcasting, it's about participation. It's about giving people a platform to share their stories, their perspectives, and their voices. At Tri-Cities Community Television, we serve Coquitlam, Port Moody, and Port Coquitlam communities, where many important stories go unreported by larger media outlets. In many ways, our region has also become what is often referred to as a news desert. There is limited, consistent coverage of local civic issues, municipal decision-making, and the work of community organizations. These are the stories that directly impact people's daily lives, and are too often they are missed. Through our work, we will fill that gap. We amplify local voices, we highlight nonprofits, we cover elections, and we create space for meaningful conversations that would not otherwise exist. Because local journalism is not about delivering information, it's about connection, accountability, and community identity. When people see themselves reflected in local media, they feel engaged. When local government is covered, there is greater transparency. When community organizations are highlighted, they are supported. Without this, communities become disconnected. But despite the importance of this work, community media organizations like ours face significant and ongoing challenges. We operate with limited and unstable funding. We lack long-term sustainability models. We are meeting increasing demand with fewer resources, and we are navigating a rapidly changing media landscape. Programs like Local Journalism Initiative have been incredibly valuable. They have allowed us to expand our journalism and better serve our community. We also recognize the support of broader federal programs such as the Canada Periodical Fund and aid to publishers, which play an important role in sustaining Canada's journalism ecosystem. However, these programs are not a complete solution for organizations like ours. In fact, our organization is currently facing critical challenge. Just a few years ago, TELUS acknowledged that we were exactly the type of community-based organization that they should be supporting, one that works with volunteers and produces programming about what is happening in our community. Since then, the funding has been cut, and that loss had a real impact. It has placed pressure on our ability to sustain programming, support our team, and continue participating fully in initiatives like LJI. We are now seeking additional funding, not just to grow, but to maintain essential operations, including arts and culture programming and program management. So today, I would respectfully encourage the committee to consider a few key actions. Continue continued and expanded support for community-based media, stable multi-year funding models that allow organizations to plan and grow, recognition of community media as essential infrastructure within Canada's media ecosystem, and investment in training and development for local journalists, particularly in underserved regions. Because community media is where stories begin. It's where people feel seen, heard, and connected. And in many cases, it's the only place where stories are told at all. We are not just reporting on our communities, we are a part of them. Thank you for the opportunity to share my perspective, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. We will go to questions from MPs now, starting with MP Waugh. You have the floor, sir, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Welcome all, and Mr. Gonez, welcome back. Should we save old media? You mentioned now that the traditional legacy media is dying slowly. We just heard from Bell Media. They're losing $40 million a year in their newsrooms across the country. Your thoughts on that?
Well, the difficulty with organizations like Bell and other traditional broadcasters and legacy players is that they're tied to an old model of doing things. And the advertising market has shifted. How they're spending dollars has shifted. And what I witnessed was that there was an opportunity to create an example of what innovation looks like in this country. Unfortunately, what happens a lot in Canada is that our systems and our industries end up being monopolized with a few key players, and innovation gets kind of pushed to the side. And so I wanted to give something a try, and it worked, and it worked really, really well. But regulation like C18 came into play and caused a huge roadblock to that innovation. Again, the intention was good. We want a strong journalism industry in this country that is reflected at all sides of the ecosystem, traditional, digital, all the things. But what C18 did was inadvertently put more harm on digital players who took that risk to innovate and safeguarded legacy players who didn't innovate fast enough.
You have 20 people hired. What's your advertising budget per year? What do you get in advertising?
So in terms of revenue, we are anywhere between 1.5 to 3 mil.
I'm going to move to Bell, if you don't mind. Full disclosure, I did work for CTV, as Mr. Gray knows. We were there forever, but decided to move on. I saw the landscape changing, and I got to be honest with you, Mr. Gray, I don't recognize CTV Saskatoon anymore. We don't have weekend news out of Saskatoon anymore. The Noon was canceled. You canceled that in February of 24, other than Toronto in the country. So you're right. We've seen a major shift in Bell Media. You claim you're losing $40 million a year, and if that is the number, you're still losing. I see your cuts are still coming. And I do see you're promoting news on Crave. So here, I'm going to throw this out. Are you going to go to digital and get rid of cable? Is Bell Media now, because you are bleeding so bad in all the newsrooms across this country, are you going to go digital and leave the cable subscription out of it now?
It's a great question that you ask, and it's a very difficult one to answer because the movement of audience has been very gradual. The movement of advertising dollars has been very gradual, and we have had to endeavor to meet the audience where it wants to see our product, when it wants to see our product. So, we have been pivoting resources to digital over the course of the last number of years, and quite proudly, I think we've been doing it very successfully. As I said in our opening statement, we are the #1 digital publisher in this country. That was not the case 2 years ago at all. We weren't even close. But news continues to be a very labor-intensive business. It's labor-intensive on the broadcast side. because of continued exhibition requirements that we must make as a result of conditions of license. And the hidden component of its labor intensity on the digital side is that every digital platform requires a manipulation of the product so that it fits from a display standpoint. So it's not as simple a process as creating a single news story and firing it out on multiple platforms. Every step of the way, every individual platform requires some degree of customization.
Agree with that. I see, you got rid of a lot of your radio stations. I see NFL football now, an American product on CTV stations on Thursday and on Sundays. And I'm not sure when I even asked the CRTC, is that allowed? Like I have a subscription to TSN. I pay for that. CTV is free. And now you're putting American football Thursday nights, which eliminates the local newscasts in many regions across this country. We have no newscasts now at all locally on the weekends. So I see you're trying to get out of local news. I really do. And when you bleed 40 million, I'm right. You're going to make more changes that you've made in February of 2024. The staff across the country are really down because they're looking over their shoulder the next day, fearing that you're going to make more cuts at Bell Media.
There is no question that there is fear that exists in our operations, and it's not just our operations. It is, it is broadcast and conventional media as a whole. Even, the digital players and platforms, both here and south of the border have had to make substantive staffing cuts in recent years. With respect to, our commitment to local, we remain very dedicated to it. As I said in our opening remarks, we, create 20,000 hours of local news across the country every year. Yes, we have eliminated weekend newscasts. We did that because the audience had dropped off. We, over a 5-year period of time, had seen a 38% drop in our weekend news audience. You mentioned noon news. The drop there was even larger. 43%, adults 25 to 54 over a 5-year period. But as I said earlier, we have pivoted resources to digital. We're trying to, meet people where they are looking to consume news. And I think the last thing that I want to add is, relates to staffing numbers. We continue to have a very healthy staff complement at our local news operations across the country. Our local English language news operations employ almost 700 people from coast to coast. In Quebec, it's an additional 235 people. So, those remain sizable numbers. And as I said, we remain deeply committed to covering local news.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Elstue, you have the floor now for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all for joining us today. Mr. Gonez, I'll admit that you've completely shifted my round of questions with your opening remarks. I represent the beautiful and growing riding of Mississauga Centre. It sits in one of the fastest growing, most diverse regions in the country. It is not a small city by any metric. That said, much of its coverage is unfortunately subsumed under Toronto. There's quite a bit in what you've said that I think speaks to the differing perspectives that define exactly why we're doing this study. Traditional media is struggling to keep pace with where Canadians are actually going. The audience has moved, but policy has not fully followed. No policy infrastructure to help start up media businesses scale. I think these are all really interesting pieces. And it speaks to something that I've brought up in the context of committee on several occasions. Younger audiences increasingly consume news differently. It's less tied to geography. It's more to platforms and personalities. In a previous study, I was quite keen on the parasocial relationship between social media and influencers and those who consume or who watch. How does your model better reflect that reality than traditional outlets?
Well, our model is built off of a lean cycle that allows for speed, that allows for authenticity, and that allows for the democratization of access. Before, the digital transformation and the rise of digital platforms, in terms of being able to access information or to be purveyors of information, you had to either had a license from the CRTC or you needed to buy a cable package. Today, all you need is what we all have in this room, which is a cell phone. And it allows anyone with that device, whether you're on dial-up or high-speed, to access information. And my only goal, why I went into this industry, got into this industry, was to be a steward of good information. That is it. I wanted to see the most amount of people receive information in the ways that they need it received, and I wanted to do it in the most authentic ways. And that's part of the DNA of GONES Media, is we actively reflect our audiences, whether they look different, whether they have different political views. We don't stray away from that. We believe that a healthy democracy should incentivize a healthy debate and a healthy ecosystem.
On this idea of being a steward of good information, independent outlets often succeed in engagement, but there's often assumption that they struggle to sustain resource-intensive journalism, like investigations without scale. Do you find that is accurate? Do you find that is a reflection of what we do see on the ground from a journalistic standpoint?
I would say in the startup phase, it doesn't matter if you're a digital startup or any new business in any industry, you're going to have your challenges finding the resources to scale. And so, yes, there is some truth to that, but there are many examples of digital innovators who have the ability to still do investigative journalism. They've built their business model being able to monetize off of platforms. But as I mentioned, with legislation like C-18 and which basically pushed Meta out of the room, Meta, which owns two of the platforms that Canadians utilize the most, that put a major roadblock in terms of monetization. And that, like I said, impacted digital media companies who are the future of this ecosystem more at risk. And so it has impacted the ability for growth, the ability to tell more stories, the ability to expand, the ability to reflect more Canadians. It's done a whole negative impact on the industry.
Interesting. Back in January and Now Toronto, you said, and I'm paraphrasing here, there was something missing for the community for more authentic stories. Could you expand on this? Is it that we're not finding people where they are? Is it that stories aren't localized enough? What do you find is missing from local stories?
Well, one of the reasons why I started GONES Media was the traditional media industry was contracting. And so there were less opportunities. And that means there was less opportunities visually. There were less opportunities of thought, less perspectives in the room, and there was more concentration. And so what I felt was needed, and as Canada continues to grow in population and continues to diversify, was that I wanted to see a difference of thought. I wanted to see a difference of experience, not just based off of where in the country you're located, but maybe from different income brackets that you may have grown up in. That is all important to having a healthy democracy, a healthy media ecosystem. And again, when we look at the platforms and the ability to access those platforms, whether as a consumer or a producer of content, it democratized that. But I have to go back to C-18. It has put a major roadblock. And I also want to make sure that this committee is fully aware that, for 3 years now with Bill C-18 in place, credible news sources, however you think about them, whatever part of the political spectrum they are on, have lost the ability to connect with Canadians on the two biggest platforms that they use every single day. What has filled that gap are less credible voices that have no news ethics, no journalism ethics. They have filled that void. We have basically ceded our responsibility, and all of the outlets, whether legacy or not, have lost 3 years of building a relationship with 40 million Canadians.
Thank you.
Monsieur Champoux, maintenant, vous avez la parole pour 6 minutes.
Mr. Champoux, 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses. I'll be transparent. I worked for Cogeco, Bell, and over 35 years ago, I worked with Mr. Lorraine. At the time, he was a morning host at CHLM in Trois-Rivières. Welcome to this important study. Madame Jamet, earlier, you spoke of something we haven't delved deeply enough into. We've spoken about different tax benefits, etc., but media deserts is something you brought up. That is particularly worrying for the Quebec countryside. Last week, RNC media representatives were here. They spoke about the Independent Local News Fund. There's an easily fixable issue there, and I really hope the minister intervenes on that. But newsrooms in the countryside, well, that's a critical issue, and I'm sure your colleague will agree with that. Radio stations in the countryside are a key resource. Now, let's talk about what impact the disappearance of just one local newsroom has in the Quebec countryside. Over to you. Thank you, Mr. Shampoo, for your wonderful question. Media deserts, as you rightly noted, are a bigger and bigger issue. Here's the impact. There's an impact on society. Citizen participation, civil implication. We see that in cities where there's no much media, people are less interested in politics. They vote less. They're more polarized. Even economically, there's an impact. It's a plague. This trend of media deserts is a real societal issue. Quebecers are aware of that. We conducted a poll. 60% of respondents realized they were aware of the reduction in local news. They thought that information was important. Radio stations play a key role in information. We're all alone. In Chibougamau, we're all alone. We're the only media outlet. Same thing in Alma, Roberval. News outlets that are involved in local society. It's not just news. It's to make the community vibrant on an economic, cultural, or political level. They play a fundamental role. In Gatineau, we have a French language radio station. They play their role. And as a society, I think we need to look into that. And today, with misinformation, as Mr. Gona said just now, digital media and foreign platforms are taking more and more of the pie with algorithms that promote visibility of misinformation. So, as a society, as a democracy, we need to make changes to support the industry. We know when quality information disappears, there's a void that is filled by misinformation. Mr. Pinault, please chime in here. You also have the challenge to create local news in the countryside on TV as well. As Caroline said, exactly, and studies have shown that a lot of the cost of public services goes up when there's not media, because media can't play their role as a watchdog, so they can't challenge public policy. And it's even a public safety issue. I remember when there were forest fires over the last few years. For instance, where local media couldn't inform residents on what to do in order to run away from the forest fires or stay safe, well, that was compromised because the local media couldn't publish information on Facebook or Instagram, for instance. It's even a public safety issue. You mentioned the regulatory burden. Cogeco, Bell, Quebecor have spoken about the regulatory burden. How much red tape you have to wade through as traditional media outlets. As you said, Madame Jamet, that it's a regulatory process that goes back decades that needs to be reworked based on the current reality. What kind of regulatory burden are you grappling with here? How much resources do you need to allocate just to deal with that paperwork? Hundreds of pages of forms to fill out. It takes up resources that could be otherwise allocated. Moreover, there are financial obligations as well. And that's in an environment where we're dealing with platforms that have zero obligation. So not only does that impact us on our ad revenue, our listeners, we're also dealing with a really competitive environment. And in order to fight in that competitive environment, on top of that, we have to deal with a regulatory system that is at operating at two speeds. We are hyper-regulated, but the digital giants aren't. And we feel like the government wants to regulate even more. There's more regulations. And that's really impacting us. Something needs to change. There needs to be a serious reduction in the amount of red tape we have to wade through. Foreign platforms are not the ones who are going to speak to Canadians, to Quebecers about what's happening at home. They're not going to provide content by us, for us, and it needs to be protected. Thank you. Thank you. And now, Mr. Genereux, for 5 minutes. Thank you. Thank you to all our witnesses. Mr. Simard. And your colleague. Question for you. How many ads has the Government of Canada placed with you in the last few years? Give me a ballpark figure. The last time we checked, 0. Zero? Okay. And is it the same thing for private radio for Madame Janet? Not 0. Excuse me. Is my mic on? Yes. The government invests millions of dollars in publicity, 76 million. Only 2 million go into radio across the country. For us, there were significant decreases in advertising. Just give me a moment and I'll pull up the exact figures. This is my point. There were significant reductions in the amount of money the government was putting into advertising. The same thing for Quebec. It's really an insignificant amount invested. So let's speak now about equity. The diversity of media used by the government to get their message out to the Canadian population, well, I think everyone should have their part of the pie. Almost 80% is going to the United States, basically. And same thing for Bell. I think Canadian media outlets ought to have an advantage. Should they have an advantage in terms of help? Madame Jamé mentioned tax credits. Is there another way to have a tax credit on ads bought for Canadian media outlets as versus private ads? Well, the discrepancy here that we're seeing is on ads bought for foreign platforms are tax deductible, but ours aren't. We've heard many times that radio were disadvantaged via taxes. The Quebec government just fixed this. That was a serious issue for radio stations. Do you think the federal government should do the same thing? Madame Jamé and Mr. Simard. Yes, clearly. The witnesses' connectivity is breaking up, but we are doing our best to summarize the content. Yes, the answer is yes. Madame Jamé. Absolutely, because at the moment, it's as if we were recognizing journalism, but it's a two-tiered system. It's not fair that radio isn't fully acknowledged. Like, for instance, physical newspapers. We're playing our role. We're playing a similar role, an equivalent role, and that ought to be recognized. One by one. Do you get money from the Google Fund for journalism? Mr. Simon, Madame Jamais, people from Bell, and Mr. Gomez. Yes. In 2 of our markets, we fulfill, but the criteria is really hard to fulfill, especially for tiny radio stations in the countryside where there's just one journalist doing the work. The speaker has frozen. We're unable to have more than that. It's just in one of our radio stations where we're able to have a little bit of money to help us out. The interpreter is doing their best to summarize the content for the speaker. Thank you. If I may, I'd just like to add something to that. The connectivity has broken up. The interpreter is doing their best. And so regarding the operating costs of $750 million for, or rather $750,000 for the Sumar Radio Group. So we're light speeds away from helping us turn a profit for those radio stations. Earlier, we talked about information deserts. Let's talk about La Pocatière. That's an area in the countryside. I think you know it well, Mr. Généreux. There are 20,000 listeners in Kamouraska and in La Pocatière. The radio station has been running thanks to a kind of transfer system, thanks to our group. And if we don't find a way to subsidize it further, those teeny tiny markets like Madame Chamay mentioned in Chibougamau, it's inevitable that those tiny radio stations will be abandoned or close or will shut down. Or cut even more. I completely agree with you. There's no more time. Oh, already? Yes, 5.5 minutes already. We'll have other rounds of questions.
The floor now for 5 minutes.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I'm delighted to hear the testimony from so many extraordinary witnesses, but given that there is a member from my own community here today, I will focus my questions on Ms. Chenna from Tri-Cities Community TV. And I just wanted to say thank you as well, because the Tri-Cities TV in the community provides an extraordinary voice. You inform and entertain us. And as you said in your own words, Ms. Chenna, your goal is to make sure that the community is seen, heard, and connected. And you and the team do an incredible job. So there is no question that community media, like the Tri-Cities Community TV, play a unique role in Canada's journalism and media landscape, telling meaningful local stories, training new voices, and reflecting community life in ways that larger outlets often cannot. Ms. Chenna, from your perspective, what do you see is the most important successes of community media in Canada, perhaps even more specifically the Tri-Cities TV, over the past decade? Merci.
Just taking a couple of notes here. I'll keep my responses brief. It has kept, community media has kept local stories alive. We've trained new voices. We've reflected in communities that larger outlets, often miss, as I mentioned. I think its biggest strength, though, is the trust and local connection of the people that surround us. I think that when we are reaching out to nonprofits, for example, that don't get to voice their what they're doing in the community, I think that matters. I think that when we are doing stories on local events like our very own Rib Fest and, a May Day Parade and even what's happening, things that are always happening in Port Moody, like the Summer Sunday concerts, for example. These are all very important things that, our community of 300,000 need to hear and know about. So I think that the landscape has changed in so many different ways. Some good sometimes and maybe some not so good. But at the end of the day, We are there and thriving. We have been there for decades, and we continue to bring community news and journalism to the people of the Tri-Cities. So thank you for your question.
Amazing, amazing. Tri-Cities TV was founded in response to the decline in cable-based community TV and with the withdrawal of private broadcasters from local production. So looking back, how do you think that changes in technology, market forces, and policy decisions contributed to the current state of local journalism and community media in Canada?
Sorry, can you just ask the question one more time, please?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
How do you think changes in technology, market forces, and policy decisions contributed to the current state of local journalism?
So technology opened doors, but it also disrupted revenue. Market consolidation and reduced local coverage and policy supports did not keep it at the pace that it's at now. I think we struggle ourselves with technology. Our demographics, I would say, is 35 to 65. You know, we don't have a young base like Mr. Brandon does, for example. But every day we are working on, just growing our own base of people that do watch us, as well as just with regards to technology changing. I feel that we could keep a better pace to that if funding allowed it. And I think that with the funding that we are getting, we're able to employ the two journalists and camera people that we do have. And we have a group of volunteers that help us daily as well. So we're moving that forward. Thank you.
And I appreciate one of your suggestions was multi-year support so that you can, in fact, plan ahead. Local media is facing serious financial and capacity pressures, as you've rightly pointed out. How does Tri-Cities TV experience the contrast between opportunity and vulnerability at the local level? What does that look like on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis?
Thank you for the question. I mentioned that, we were cut funding a few years ago by TELUS. Of course, there is a need for local media and organizations there is a need for financial help with organizations like ourselves, but we work with limited resources, and you've been an amazing advocate for us, and thank you for that. And I think that you see and we are working out of libraries that donate their space. We don't have our own space, for example, to go and leave our things. We're often setting up and taking down, and it's very difficult. But just last week, I did 8 interviews in 3 hours because the library was busy, and we had to get those out there. So I think we work with limited resources. It's hard to staff. It's hard to fund, and the impact is strong, but the stability is not.
Merci.
Pour 2 minutes et demie.
Merci beaucoup. Je reviens vers vous.
Thank you very much. I'll come back to you, Madame Jamet. And you've been representing media for years to the federal government and talking about helping out traditional media rather than digital platforms. This is a documented issue. It's a flagrant injustice. How do you explain this refusal to understand that traditional radio and TV are just as important and deserving of advertising dollars? Please speak to that. I simply cannot comprehend, especially when the federal government just announced a strategy on buying Canadian and Canadian sovereignty to take care of businesses here in Canada. We find that it's incoherent with that strategy. Do you have the impression that Quebecers no longer enjoy that medium, TV and radio? However, studies are very clear. I read one recently. You have numbers that you shared with us. Quebecers and Canadians still really like traditional media, radio and TV, even if in parallel they do consult digital platforms. What can we tell the federal government? I've been here for 7 years. For 7 years, we've been telling them that we need to better distribute ad funding. And we're not saying that they should stop putting ads on digital platforms, but do you think there would be a way to help the survival of many regional news outlets? Excellent question. This is what I'd say. We're speaking to Canadians every year. We have 1.7 million listeners a week. Our media perform well. The issue is the business model. Now let's talk about the impact and the societal influence. Our media outlets play a unique role that is recognized. For instance, the poll that we mentions that. And so how are people getting their news? What content are they producing? Is it credible content? Is it recognized content that's considered credible by Canadians and Quebecers? I think this content needs to be shared efficiently, but Quebec media from here is doing an amazing job. I absolutely think that the government that buys advertising should review their policies. Well, yes, we've been sharing that information. They need to hear it.
5 minutes.
Mr. Gray, I'm told that CTV's national news is the most watched newscast in the country and has been so for more than 3 decades. Your competitor, CBC, gets $1.5 billion in tax money. So how do you manage to outperform CBC given their huge financial advantage?
Hard work and dedication. You know, that's probably the short and simple answer. You know, our team works very hard, on a nightly basis to, cover this country from coast to coast. We draw upon the resources of our local market stations to help with that process. We have dedicated news gathering teams from a national news standpoint in every Canadian province. We make it our goal from a populist point of view to reflect this country back to itself on a nightly basis. And what I mean when I say that is that, we recognize and acknowledge that not everything from a news coverage standpoint needs to be about destruction or death. It is critically important for us as a news organization to, celebrate the unique things that make this country great. The people, places, and things that are truly different in Canada. Go ahead.
I was a journalist, actually, myself for 3 decades, and I spent most of that time in the newsroom of the Edmonton Sun, where we were editorially a conservative-leaning paper. So that said, we spent most of our time when it came to politics holding the government of the day to account, particularly in the province of Alberta that had conservative governments forever. But today I notice CTV and other organizations seem more fixated, at least federally, on attacking opposition conservatives. Why do you think that is, and what do you think can be done to stop that?
I disagree with that characterization. From the standpoint of our news organization, what we seek to do is to provide coverage that is balanced and fair to all participants in the political system. I consider us to be doing our job when both sides are complaining equally loud about the work that we're doing. I consider us to be doing our job when we are going right up the middle.
Okay, fair enough. In 2024, CTV News was caught altering a video clip of Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. It maliciously misrepresented his words, and 2 people were fired over this. What's being done to ensure this kind of travesty never happens again?
So, we took considerable and great steps, in light of what transpired. We apologized what transpired, and we did an immediate investigation that ultimately, as you said, led to the termination of 2 staff members. You know, I am on record with other House of Commons committees on this matter as saying it is the first and only time in my career that I have ever seen anything like that happen. And, you know, I stand by that.
Peter Menzies, former CRTC vice chair, told this committee last week that he believes objectivity is gone from newsrooms. He said objectivity is, quote, an enormous challenge for public broadcasters. He also said most newsroom reporters on the center left politically. And I experienced that myself at a conservative newspaper years ago. What do you make of that, and what is CTV doing to ensure its journalists are objective?
So we have a number of guardrails in place at CTV. We have a news policy that has requirements with respect to you know, our creation of content. We adhere to the Canadian Association of Broadcasters Code of Ethics. We adhere to the RTDNA Canada Code of Ethics. And in addition, in the digital space, we are part of what is called the Trust Project. All of those spell out very clearly you know, what is expected of journalism organizations and how journalists conduct themselves. You know, and I can say this, you know, in you know, any newsroom that I have ever been a part of, there has never been a conversation about the adoption of a particular political point of view. In fact, quite the contrary. The conversation is always about, you know, how do we ensure that all voices are heard, all perspectives are reflected.
Thank you. Monsieur Toumba, vous avez la parole maintenant pour 5 minutes.
Over to you for 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to all our witnesses for being here today, and those who are online. Mr. Gonez, during your remarks, you've often mentioned C18. In your opinion, has this impacted media controversies? And let's examine this in context. Before it happened, many of us were consulted, let's say, small regional news outlets on Facebook, for instance. At the time, when I opened Facebook, I listened to Radio Canada on Facebook. And so social media allowed local media to get more listeners. But today, with C18, some media, thanks to the government and teamwork, have received $118 million to help media outlets. Do you think that that is something that helps media? That helps media in Canada? And that we should allow people to be on Meta freely?
So it's a good question. Here's the thing. That money is being deployed. Is it helping? Mic check, mic check.
No. Open.
Oh.
There's a little button at the front.
Yes.
How about now?
Perfect.
Is that now? Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. We'll do it live. To your question, C18, I think what the government at the time may have not have understood it was, you know, Meta-owned platforms like Facebook, like Instagram, were huge referral traffic drivers back to publishers, legacy publishers, digital publishers. That in turn allowed traffic to increase natively, which then allowed publishers, again, whether traditional or digital, to then sell off that traffic to garner advertising revenue. everybody lost that traffic. Everybody lost that traffic. And the $100 million, when I look at it in the grand scheme of things, is a drop in the bucket to what it put at risk. From the digital innovation side, that stopped a whole industry that was booming. I know of digital publishers who are smaller in scale than my organization who have gone out of business or who are literally at risk of going out of business despite the $100 million from Google. Because at the end of the day, that money is tied to how many people you employ. It's not tied to impact. So what does that then foster? It fosters organizations who probably weren't on the right trajectory in terms of impact, but now have bloated operations, but are still not reaching the amount of Canadians that they should be reaching. Whereas the organizations that were building business models actually reaching those Canadians are not offered any incentive to continue doing that. And it all goes back to what type of country are we trying to foster? What type of business ecosystem are we trying to foster? I'm not here to say to, forget the legacy players, push them to the wayside, none of that. But what I am saying is that we can't protect an industry that is dying at the expense of a group of organizations in a new industry that was being fostered. And that is what we've essentially have done over the last 3 years, is that we've protected the old guard at the expense of a new generation of media companies and organizers who took a risk, who put their livelihoods on the line, who started employing Canadians across this country in different regions, who brought diversity of thought to people's screens. It may not have been the big screen, it was a smaller screen, but it's the screens that Canadians are consuming content on. And we've hindered that, we stifled that growth. So is that money good? For me, I look at it as a stopgap. It's holding organizations together that essentially have to do that hard work to reinvent themselves. And we may lose some of those organizations. However, on the flip side, there were organizations who potentially could have grown bigger to replace those organizations or to complement the loss that those organizations were dealing with.
Merci, Monsieur Pinault, pour vous.
Thank you. Mr. Pinault, could you respond to the question? Regarding C18, the issue is especially that Meta is not part, or rather does not compensate media outlets. Yes, media were excluded from platforms like Facebook and Instagram, but there's still a lot of information that's stolen from our media that's reused by others. Or there's misinformation on those platforms. We must be careful when we talk about an impact, because the program's aim is to compensate journalists who do journalism and the impact of our stories, covering communities that are in rural areas, coming out with the reports that take months of work. That's different from the impact of clicks. What we were trying to do with that program was to compensate journalism, quality journalism, done by journalists on the ground. Thank you. Your time is up.
Now for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gonez, you've made some interesting points here today. With regards to Bill C-18, it seems that perhaps the government made a few mistakes on it. We want to make sure that Canadians have access to local news. We want to make sure that it is a thriving ecosystem within our country. Certainly that is the case. However, in order to do that, news needs to be where people are, which is largely digital nowadays, not in these antiquated systems. However, when $8 million goes to a place like Bell to prop up an already existing system, and no money goes to Tri-Cities, and about $100K goes to you, I see an incredible imbalance here. Because really, at the end of the day, you're actually meeting the audience where they're at and giving more of what they want. And so Bill C-18 had an opportunity to make sure that Canadians were in fact getting what they needed, to make sure that the ecosystem was in fact strengthened. But based on the testimony that I've heard here today, it hasn't hit that mark. So what could be done better then to make sure that we're actually providing for the needs of Canadians in terms of their access to news?
It's a great question. Just want to make sure this is on. Yep, okay. It goes back and my thought process is always, let's incentivize. We should be incentivizing Canadian businesses and advertisers to actually spend money with digital media companies who, again, have taken that risk and who have built business models that are now ready to scale. Like, that's actually the opportunity that's before us right now, is that we have digital media companies that really, if we didn't have C18 and weren't being hindered from the two biggest platforms that Canadians utilize, would be scaling at an exponential rate right now. But right now, we're dealing with that roadblock. So what I would love to see is that if we are going to utilize funds, let's create an incentive program so that if advertisers are working directly with these media companies, digital media companies, maybe they get an incentive, whether that's a tax write-off or whatever, so that they're working directly. So, because what happens when an advertiser wants to spend money with Canadian media, there is a funnel, there's a pipeline of all of these people in the middle, where that's where it gets siphoned off. And that infrastructure in the middle, whether it's ad agencies, DSPs, SSPs, ad exchanges, they're all owned by Americans. So that's why most of the money ends up south of the border and doesn't end up in the hands of whether it's legacy publishers or digital first publishers. So there needs to be an incentive for Canadian organizations to work directly with Canadian-owned digital media companies. And that in turn will see more of that money stay here in Canada. That in turn will create more opportunities, more jobs, and so forth. There also needs to be a special program, again, for digital media companies who have taken that risk so that they can continue to grow. I look at some of the funds that are out there, like the Canadian Periodical Fund, for example. A lot of those programs are based and solely help, legacy players who do print, for example. I'm not saying don't do print, but when I look at the numbers, the people reading a newspaper and buying a newspaper continues to dwindle every single day, but the organizations that are creating content for people where they are at, they don't have access to these programs. And those funds, and they're never part of the conversation. They're always looked at as an afterthought. What I'm saying is that we now need to be central in this conversation. We need to be key stakeholders in revolutionizing and creating the framework of how our media ecosystem looks in the future. Again, C18, the intention was good. I think everybody here can agree that we need a solid media ecosystem, and that includes players, all of us here at this table. But what C18 did is that it inadvertently impacted new innovators, digital media startups, more heavily than the traditional players. And so all we did is safeguard an industry that was already struggling and players who were already struggling, and those that were actually doing well on the precipice of becoming big national media companies at scale to compete with even in the likes of the US were harmed in the process.
Mr. Gonez, may I just summarize quickly then? Am I hearing you correctly then to say that if we're going to think about policy changes in this country and fairness toward media, we need to think about incentivizing innovation and creativity rather than trying to prop up an old model that isn't working for Canadians?
I would say that that should be the first thought. I think that what works well is if we could have a combination of the two, because some players will need some time to adjust, but again, it cannot be at the expense of those that did the hard work already and are now being sacrificed in the process.
Mr. Miles, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Chair. Peut-être on peut commencer avec Madame Jamet. Vous avez des
Let's start
suggestions?
with Madame Chimay. You've talked about tax credits, how it works now, how it can work in the future. We tend to say the government isn't spending enough. Well, it's not that we're saying that, but that it's said that the government isn't spending enough on ads in Canada. But it's also a trend in the private market. It's not just the government of Canada. It's a generalized trend, from my understanding. How can we support those investments with tax credits in Canada? Thank you for your question. Not all advertisers prioritize foreign platforms. We have clients all over in our markets that prioritize local media. I can give you many examples. So, not all businesses prioritize foreign outlets. Local ads is the bread and butter of our news outlets all over our network. Second, this measure would be a structural measure for the media industry. A 20% tax credit would be an important incentive for advertisers to prioritize local media. Moreover, C19, or rather Section 19, originally Section 19 was put in place. This section was put in place to protect Canadian media, to favor Canadian investment. Unfortunately, over time, it was never updated, so there's a legal loophole at the moment. So Meta, Facebook are considered as Canadian media outlets, so people can have a tax write-off when they buy ads on Facebook and Meta. This is what we're asking for. We want this to be fixed. So we want this rule to get back to the spirit in which it was written, which was to prioritize Canadian media. We just want an update because right now it's a loophole. Wow, that's very interesting. That's exactly what I wanted to clarify. So this decision to put Google and Meta, to include them in the same category as Canadian media, how did that happen? What year did that happen? How did this come about? I don't have the exact year, but the rules were written when there was just traditional media. Digital media did not exist. So it was written so that if a Canadian business bought advertising in the New York Times, for instance, they wouldn't get a tax write-off. Whereas if they bought ads in a Canadian newspaper, they would get the tax credit. But it was written before digital platforms existed. That's why it needs to be updated, because right now, in the law, it's written simply traditional media. Digital media is not mentioned. That's why it's a loophole. Wow, that's really interesting. Now, I have a question on the rule in Quebec, and that was changed with the radio category. Because that was the other suggestion, that there be a larger category. Can you go into that, please? So the Quebec budget was tabled a few weeks ago. It hasn't been passed yet, but the provincial government in Quebec has provided for measures that TV and radio will now have access to the journalism tax credit. That fund would be expanded to radio and TV and not just written news. Because right now there's a two-tiered system of journalism. Some that do have access to this help and some that don't. At the time being, the federal government continues to exclude radio in its rules. So we're asking for the federal government to do what Quebec did, which was recognize the importance and the journalism impact of radio. We're asking for parity, and we're asking for this program to apply to radio, just like it's happened in Quebec. Well, or like will happen in Quebec when the budget is passed. And specifically for journalism work in radio. Exactly, yes. Fantastic, thank you. And 2.5 minutes, Mr. Champoux. Earlier, Mr. Gonez talked about measures put in place, saying they were measures that were put in place to save an industry that was dying. I just want to correct that. Traditional media is not dying. Radio and TV are still Canadians and Canadians' favorite media. I think it's an industry that was crushed by regulation at a time when they were being invaded by digital media that were not regulated in time. I remember in the beginning of the 2000s, when we were first discussing regulating digital news platforms, the new players in the industry, music at the time, the CRTC said, well, I can't imagine reading the news on our phone. There was no vision of what technology would evolve to become. So if we had regulated in time, the media ecosystem would be really different. Digital media would be regulated. So they would have accessed a regulated media ecosystem instead of having it be the Wild West. It's like saying, oh, flying cars will never happen. And when flying cars get here, oh, well, they can just get into accidents because we're saying, oh, well, we didn't see it happen, so we don't have to regulate it. So I think it's a real lack of vision. And that's reflected in many decisions that have been made by the government. And I think it's really too bad. Moreover, the measures that you're proposing are measures that are easy. Expanding the tax credit for radio and TV. That's an easy fix. We don't need to pass a bill for it. Advertising in traditional media. We're not saying that we're going to stop buying ads on digital platforms. In 2026, it's really part of what we have to do. But it's not hard. It's not hard to keep part of your advertising budget and send it to traditional media. Media needs to renew their requests year after year. They have no predictability. And so these changes aren't hard. So I simply cannot understand why this government is letting radio stations die. And those losses will have impacts in the countryside first. It's not in cities like Montreal. It's in small cities like Chibougamau or rural areas. It'll be really small TV and radio stations that'll be impacted. That's where it'll hurt the most, so I cannot understand why that's done. There are good programs. The Independent Local News Fund, for instance, it's really a well-thought-out program. We want predictability. We want engagement, and we want to save this industry. So I just said 2.5 minutes. I'm not asking questions. I'll come back to it later, but I really needed to get that out. They're really easy measures to take. I cannot understand why they haven't been put in place and why they haven't been in place already.
This is to Mr. Gray. I'm going to share my time with Bernard as well. Mr. Gray, Scott Reid, Paul Martin's former communications director, is a vocal detractor, critic of our conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, and a regular CTV commentator on Vasi Capello's show. I'm told that recently his son, Jack Reid, was named a senior advertising advisor in Carney's PMO, and that seems to me a bit of a conflict of interest. Do you think that Scott Reid should be featured on CTV given this conflict of interest, or at the very least, shouldn't this be disclosed to your audience?
Every time that Scott Reid appears on air, we identify him as liberal. We do that with all of our political analysts. We do that when Lisa Raitt appears as a conservative analyst. We do that when Thomas Mulcair appears as an NDP analyst.
Do you mention that his son works for the Prime Minister?
No, we don't.
Isn't that fairly pertinent?
I don't believe so, no.
When Justin Trudeau won in 2015, Bruce Anderson, whose daughter worked in the PMO's office, recused himself from the At Issue panel when commenting on CBC. So, does CBC have higher ethics than CTV?
I'm not familiar with what you just shared, but based on what you said, he chose to recuse himself.
But isn't that not the journalistic ethical thing to do? When you have a direct conflict, for instance, the conflict that this person on your panel has somebody who works for the Prime Minister of Canada.
We do not misrepresent the point of view that Scott Reid offers. We label him as a liberal every time he appears on air.
He's more than just a liberal, however. His son works, I'm told, for the Prime Minister of Canada. You don't disclose that.
No.
That's unfortunate.
À mon tour maintenant, je suis à peu près sûr qu'il n'y a
My
pas trop
turn now. Like all MPs, I often use the media. Groupe Simard is one of the media outlets that I use, along with 3 radio stations in my riding. Thank you for the work that you do. Your very important work. Mr. Lorien, earlier you quickly touched on tax credits. Can you give us so has the radio industry already estimated what it would cost? The lack of revenue if this tax credit was taken away. I don't think so, no. I don't think that there's been a study on that throughout the country. However, this is a question of equity. In Canada, there are 2 categories of journalists: journalists who work for written media and those who work for digital media. As you know, written newspapers have a tax credit that starts at 35%. So for equity, that should be expanded to all journalism outlets. But no, we haven't calculated the exact amount. That's not... Well, and so this study is on equity of media. Madame Jamet, or Mr. Pinault, can you tell us how much money you get from the federal government now? Yes, we receive $100,000, or rather a bit less than $800,000. I'd also like to mention this. As a business, we're deprioritized compared with vertical groups, those that have TV, digital, radio, whereas we're only in one industry. We're in radio and audio, and I'd like to also say that we're also digital. Everyone's smartphone is a radio. But the amounts that we get are a lot smaller, and it's not enough. Mr. Pinault, for all of Bell Media, $8 million. Do I have any time left? Inaudible.
To Mr. Miles again for 5 minutes.
Great, thank you very much. We've heard a little bit in the House, and I'm just taking this opportunity to get some clarification on how we've arrived here and how best to move forward about more organizations being able to access some of these support funds, notably Chorus Entertainment when they. Is there maybe there's someone here that can speak to what's happened to the fund, obviously, as more people have been able to apply to it, and what that means for the reality of your organizations now? Or if I'm making any sense. I think this has been a pertinent issue because it's come up in the House a couple of times, and so I just wondered if there was any thoughts on that.
Commentaire sur cette chose-là. L'industrie de la...
The radio industry is particularly at a disadvantage, let's say, compared to other media forms. Newspapers get money and have for years. And when we're in TV, when we do TV production, we don't take any risks because all of the funding is planned for. In radio, we create 100% of our content, and that's not supported. So I think that as an industry, programs that were put in place for the last few years prioritized TV, written news. However, radio, apart from the Google Fund, which is for rural news, that's temporary, moreover, and that excludes major cities, well, we don't have access to those programs. That really needs to be rethought because the radio industry is key. It's existed for a long time. Radio is very strong as an industry, And we particularly need to examine the radio industry. And this injustice must cease for radio compared to other platforms that have been supported for many years.
Absolutely.
Yeah, if I can. I don't know why mine is so finicky. But I also just want to make reference to the fact that it's not just, a lot of the media companies here, and the one that you just referenced, for example, it's not just news that they do, it's also content creation. And outside of the programs that we've kind of been talking about today, there are other programs with that type of content creation, whether it's television programs or whatever, that are able to touch into resources like CMF, right, the Canadian Media Fund. My organization, we create similar types of content that get distributed on platforms like YouTube, for example, or on digital platforms like TikTok, and we don't have any access to CMF funding because we don't get a broadcast letter from any of the broadcasters. However, we pour extensive resources into creating this content. It's watched by hundreds of thousands of Canadians every single week, and we do so without the advantages that some of our bigger competitors are able to tap into. So I do want to also make mention that as we're looking not just at the few programs that we've been talking about, the tax credits, LJI, the Google money, there's other public funds that taxpayers are pouring into that digital startups are also still not able to tap into. And so we still got to talk about, the gates that are being blocked, that are still being, closed on digital startups in this country.
I appreciate that. I'm glad you brought it up. Of course, we're focusing on the journalism part, but that's been a conversation that I've had for sure on the content creation side, on the YouTube side. Specifically, just to go back a little bit, Mr. Gonez, in terms of what you mentioned at the intro, just in terms of some of the incentives that could be there for innovation. What do you think specifically that might look like?
I think it could look like a plethora of ways. I think there could be a tax incentive where digital media companies could get a portion of what they spend on innovation written off, for example, or back as a subsidy. I think there could be a special fund that's created potentially by advertisers who do spend on digital platforms like Meta, for example, for advertising. Maybe there's a percentage that goes into a fund that can be deployed just to digital media companies, because again, that's what our model is based off of. We can't tap into other programs because we don't own infrastructure in the airwaves, for example, or licenses like radio licenses or TV licenses. So I think, it is an opportunity to think of different ways, but I would start off with an incentive program. And I think we got to, again, I don't also want to create an industry where we're solely reliant on these government programs to survive. I would rather an industry where it's so robust that advertisers and companies are inclined to spend money with Canadian digital media companies because it just makes sense. Actually, we want it to make dollars, not cents, but you know what I mean. So again, I just want us to think about this as a full-pronged approach.
I guess I was wondering, when you say innovation incentives or even the fund, it's helpful to sometimes just go, what might that look like? What incentives would be helpful to support specifically in terms of, technological incentives and those kind of things in your business?
Yeah, so I mean, when I look at the tax credit for like the journalism tax credit, right, it was originally 25%, now it's 35%. It would be great if there was a digital innovation incentive, maybe it's a 25% tax credit, right, to help offset the losses that we've experienced over the last 3 years. And at the time, Canada's Heritage Minister did say that he would make sure that we were made whole. That has never happened, and I don't know if it ever will. But I do believe that there is a way that the government can do this. I think that this committee is open to doing that. And so there should be potentially maybe an additional 25% tax credit for digital media companies who are innovating at scale. And again, it's to inspire these companies and to motivate these companies to become bigger, because we are the ones creating jobs. You hear about these job losses every single quarter, or at a certain time of year in particular companies. A lot of times when we're hiring, we're getting these people, we're retraining them, We're doing that grunt work to make sure that they are now equipped to succeed in the industry that we are at now. I can't tell you how many colleges have reached out to my company asking for us to consult on how to rebrand their programs, how to make their broadcasting programs relatable but relevant for the 21st century. The demand is so much that I don't have time. My team doesn't have time. But the amount of colleges across...
You need to hire more people, clearly.
Well, if I was still on my platforms, my revenue would be 3 times it is. So this is the impact, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Mr. Waugh, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll probably share my time with Ms. Thomas. The question period on Sunday, Mr. Gray, aired the Prime Minister's full 10-minute video, unedited, no criticism, no fact-checked, no opposition voice, when the Prime Minister talked about weakness with the United States. As Vice President of CTV News, were you informed before that this platform, which is YouTube, would be used on CTV question period on Sunday?
We were aware that the Prime Minister was making an address to the nation that was pre-recorded. And we did reach out to the opposition Conservatives to get their point of view. As soon as it was provided to us, we did use it on air. And in fact, we aired the opposition leader's rebuttal in its entirety yesterday.
I saw that. Are you concerned an American platform like YouTube is being used today to give the message to Canadians?
It's an interesting question that you ask, and I'm going to make a general statement. I have been very concerned in recent years that politicians of all political stripes have chosen to do more interviews with American news outlets as it relates to the trade issue in this country than Canadian news outlets. I remain concerned that politicians seem to be more reluctant than in the past to speak directly to broadcast and traditional media outlets. That said, I do recognize and acknowledge that no one has an obligation to speak to us, but I think all politicians should want to. Because, as I said, we reach a huge number of Canadians. More than 11 million between our local and national newscasts on a weekly basis. And from a digital standpoint, we reach 46% of Canadians every month.
Like Mr. Gomez said, it's shifting from legacy media to digital outlets in this country, and I think that's what you saw Sunday with YouTube, an American platform being used here in Canada to give the message of the Prime Minister. Good on you, I will say. Yesterday you had the opposition leader. So I'll move over to Ms. Thomas now, who will conclude our comments for the day.
Thank you. Mr. Gray, you said earlier that you produce 20,000 hours of local news per year, or that Bell does. That's correct? Perfect. And I'm just wondering, how does this compare with previous years? Is this number going up or down?
That number would roughly be the same as last year.
Okay, and the year before that?
Year before that, there would have been some reduction as a result of our cancellation of weekend and noon newscasts.
Okay. As you know, a part of the mandate of Bill C-18, which now has become the Google Fund of $100 million, it's given out by the Journalism Collective. You've been given $8 million. As a part of that, the requirement is that local news is supposed to be increasing. We're supposed to be reaching more Canadians. So in your estimation, then, should you continue to receive those Google dollars to the tune of $8 million?
So I'm glad that you've asked this question. I think there are a couple of critical points that need to be made about the $8 million that we receive. We and all recipients of the Google dollars don't necessarily receive that to prop up legacy media. We receive that as compensation for those particular platforms utilizing content we produce. I think the other, key component part to my responding to your question is that we don't receive $8 million because we're Bell. We don't receive $8 million because we asked for $8 million. We receive $8 million because of the number of journalists we employ.
I'll take back my time. Thank you, Mr. Gray. Thank you. The point of the Google dollars, the Bill C-18 dollars, if you will, is to further local news. And you have just stated today that Bell Media has failed to do that, that the number of hours being produced year over year has actually declined since receiving those Google dollars. So in my estimation then, Bill C-18 is either not doing its job or has some alternative effort in mind, which I think is very sad for Canadians, because at the end of the day, they need access to local news. And that's certainly not where the dollars are going, as you just admitted.
$8 million in funding from Google because of the number of journalists that we employ.
Thank you. Mr. Al-Sood, you have the floor now for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I started my last round by highlighting my slight frustration with the beautiful city of Toronto. My next question is for our friends from Bell Media, Mr. Gray and Mr. Pinault. What would it take financially or structurally for a market like Mississauga to sustain deeper, dedicated coverage?
That's not an easy.
I'm sorry to interrupt for just a quick second. There's some clicking of a pen or something right at the microphone that's interfering with the interpreters. So just be mindful that the interpreters are picking up all the sounds from the microphone. Thank you. Go ahead. Start over.
I mean, that's not an easy question to answer, but I will say this: we actually have taken strides through our 24-hour local service, CP24, in the GTHA of late to expand our coverage into all communities in that region. We just launched a weekly feature where mayors from all of the GTHA communities are provided with an opportunity to showcase their favorite event happening in their community on a weekly basis. We are endeavoring every 2 weeks to get out and do broadcast live on location from various areas inside of the GTHA, and we do have plans to double down on broader coverage.
From your experience from a newsroom economic standpoint, does proximity to a major hub like Toronto crowd out investment in distinct local reporting capacity in adjacent cities?
No, not necessarily. I mean, a good story is a good story. And our news organizations in Toronto, be they CTV Toronto or CP24, have long held the point of view that their responsibility is not to just cover the city of Toronto, but the broader Greater Toronto Hamilton area.
Fantastic. Thank you, Mr. Gray. Mr. Simard, les diffuseurs régionaux opèrent dans des
Regional broadcasters work in a very different context. There are certain specific regions where local information, or rather local news stations, are no longer viable, but they are in other markets. So what distinguishes those two markets, please? Well, the size of markets has a big influence on the question. We mostly work with local businesses, and so if there's a healthy local market, well, then that's easier for us to thrive. I think generally radio stations, well, they still work well, as Madame Jamed said earlier. Radio stations still reach Canadians. And so when there's investment in our radio stations, people will seek us out. That's primarily what distinguishes those small markets, but at the end of the day, competition in those markets is really, really tough, and other small radio stations have the same issues with the workforce and that competitive environment, so we're sharing a part of the pie that's just getting thinner and thinner and thinner, and we're doing our best despite the explosion of costs that we don't have any control over. Equipment, that's gotten way more expensive over the last few years. So the material we need to do our job, well, that cost is hard to bear at the moment. And when you have less resources, what's the first thing to get cut? The number of journalists, the scope of your coverage, or the depth of your reporting? Journalism hasn't been affected, for us, at least in the last few years. That's the most important thing for us. We want to keep on playing our role in offering quality service, and luckily we haven't had to make that gut-wrenching decision. As an operation, we've been able to do things differently and try to not cut journalism. We didn't have to make that decision, luckily, and so our journalism has been maintained, and we hope to continue to maintain our journalism. Thank you, Mr. Simar.
Vision often fills gaps left by larger players. From the feedback you've received, where are those gaps most prominent?
For our organization, thank you for the question. For our organization, I think the gaps are in equipment. Our funding only goes so far. We split the LJI funding between two journalists that do a great job. We have them always working by the seat of their pants, interviews here and interviews there. Having said that, we struggle with equipment. We try to keep our hosts happy, our journalists happy. The LGI funding, though, is only for the people that are creating the story. It isn't for me as someone who interviews. It isn't, towards equipment. $80,000 only goes so far, and that's what we are getting. I'll just be fully transparent. And we were surprised to get that, but the Canadian Media Fund has been excellent in providing us that, and we hope that the program continues. I know it is up until 2027, and as you heard earlier, just the multi-year funding would really help us out. A lot of newspapers have gone by the wayside. Our Tri-City News, a few weeks ago or maybe a month ago, I know Freshette was here, and so they were here supporting their stance. So there are outlets, but there are few and far between, and I just feel that the connection and the importance of what we're doing is really important. I know everyone's here to talk about everything on a global level. I feel like a small fish in a big pond, but I'm here to be in the pond, and as big or small that it is, I'm really grateful, so thank you for the question.
Thank you, Ms. Chenna.
Mr. Champoux, pour 2 minutes et demie.
Et si vous
Mr.
permettez,
Champoux, for 2.5 minutes. If I may, I'll indulge my nostalgia. Mr. Laurent, when we worked together, Michelle, in the beginning of the 90s, or 91, I think, you were the morning man, and I was there on the weekend. You had a great show at noon. We had news shows. There were news shows all day long. There was a talk radio, and there was one other AM station. So there were only 2 AM radio stations, and it really represented local radio in similar stations. But we had this connection. The radio stations were connected with the people they served. There was a relationship with those listeners. At the time, that was really how it was. And does that still exist in the countryside and rural areas? That is that really tight-knit link between radio stations and their listeners. Is there still that magical relationship between radio stations in the countryside and their listeners? First off, there's this desire to have it. Well, less than 30 years ago, for lots of reasons. First, the economy, financial reasons, but despite it all, I think that there are really deep roots of radio stations in their communities. There's a great example of that in Radio Samar and Rivière-du-Loup, where there's a lot of information that maintains this link with the community. And I would add, even for operations that I would say are quote-unquote non-profitable, for instance, broadcasting the baseball final, the senior baseball final of Bas Saint Laurent. And so you're not making a profit, but it's an activity that really consolidates this link between the radio station and the community. In Roberval, in Saguenay, when people finish crossing the lake, everyone is talking about it in the radio. And the radio stays, and the radio broadcasts until the very last boat be out of Lake St. John. It's not profitable, but it creates a real link with the community. I thought that was important to highlight in closing because we've talked about money and we've talked about the economic issue. I think we really needed to highlight that link and the importance of local radio stations and that relationship they have with their communities. Radio is an old media, but it still reaches 85% of Canadians every week. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all of our witnesses today.
If there's something you've forgotten to mention today or something that occurs to you later, if you come across more data you think this committee should have, please submit it to us through the clerk, and we can include that information as we go through and develop a report at the end of this study. Thank you again for your time today. Meeting